the release of the report on climate change and heat-induced mortality in India,
which provides detailed analysis of the economic and human costs that India is likely to face in the wake of climate change. And it can provide a vital tool to inform policymakers of the scale and the nature of actions required to limit the impact of the climate change in India today.
This is the first release of information from what's will broadly be known in the future as the Indian Climate Prospectus, which is looking very detailed at different outcomes across Indian society as the climate changes.
हम सब मानते हैं कि आज हम क्लाइमेट चेंज को लेकर के एकदम टिपिंग पॉइंट पर खड़े हैं और अभी नहीं तो कभी नहीं वाली स्थिति आज हमारी है। कोई ऐसा देश नहीं होगा जिस पर इसका कोई इम्पैक्ट नहीं आएगा, लेकिन इस इम्पैक्ट को सबसाइड करने के लिए सबको एक साथ खड़े होना पड़ेगा। भारत, जैसा मैंने कहा कि केवल हमारे पास में 4% पीने का पानी है और 18% आबादी और क्लाइमेट चेंज के इम्पैक्ट जो है साफ सामने दिखाई दे रहे हैं। ऐसी परिस्थितियों में ये आवश्यक है कि ये जल का विषय जो है ये जन का विषय बने, आम जन का विषय बने। एंड आई फील माई सेल्फ प्राउड दैट आई एम पार्ट ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट जिसने ये कमिटमेंट लिया है कि आने वाले 2024 तक हम 20% काम जो है वाटर यूज एफिकेसी पर काम करेंगे, 20% इसको रिड्यूस करेंगे।
We've seen the release of many reports, we've heard a lot of data on climate change, but I don't think I've come across anything which has been so unremittingly bleak. Almost every chart, every graph is just pointing upwards. Temperatures are going up, mortality is going up, the average number of days of high temperatures are going up. So how do we get out of this almost near apocalyptic kind of scenario that we find ourselves in? What are the solutions? What are the ways forward for India, which also has to, of course, balance its commitment to reducing emissions with this constant dilemma of how it can also continue to grow? And who better to take on some of those challenges and questions than Michael Greenstone. He's the faculty director at the Tata Centre for Development at the University of Chicago and co-founder of the Climate Impact Lab. Seema Arora is here, Deputy Director General of CII, the Confederation of Indian Industry, and Kamal Kishore, member of the National Disaster Management Authority. So, Michael, if I can just set the ball rolling with you, give us a sense of whether there is almost an inevitability to your findings, or are there ways that we can try to minimize the impact or minimize the bad news?
Yeah, so I think there's no escaping that India is kind of at the perfect storm center of the climate challenge, in the sense that it's a country that's already hot, and it's a country that is starting from a relatively low income level. So it's unfortunately very, perfectly positioned to face some of the most severe climate damages in the world.
Right.
So I think what the report highlights is the need for aggressive and innovative adaptation techniques. So techniques that we don't currently have to protect people from what's coming. And the report has very detailed information on what it's going to look like in each district in India. And in principle, that can be used by local governments to develop effective techniques. So that's what happens if climate change comes. I think the second part of it is it underscores the urgency of reducing the rate of climate change. And India is now a major player on the global scene, and I think perhaps maybe this will provide some further motivation to help put back together an international consensus about confronting climate change.
Right. I just want to follow up with one of the things that the report does, which is it actually looks at climate change as a cause of deaths and the fact that now that is going up. So it says that by the year 2100, almost 1.5 million more people are projected to die as a result of climate change. So in a way, it brings all the data home. When one talks of rising temperatures and so on, often there's a certain amount of abstraction associated with that. But this is actually telling you that this is impacting something as basic as life and death. Give us a sense of what exactly are the specific triggers that are actually likely to cause deaths. Are we talking about heat waves and so on, floods?
Yeah, so the analysis is built on global data on temperatures and global data on mortality. And then we make projections into the future based on how the climate's going to change and how India's income will evolve. And at its core, what we can observe is that when there are very hot days, let's call them above 30 degrees C, there tends to be very elevated rates of mortality. Those show up in different causes of death, some logical, some that I think people talk about all the time, stroke and things like that.
Right.
But they really show up in a wide range of deaths. And so we think of this as kind of a collection of all mortality related to high temperatures.
Okay. Right. So, Seema, if I could just ask you, now that we've all heard the bad news, this entire business, and I mentioned this in my introduction, about how we balance out these two needs, about the fact that India wants to be a high growth economy, ambitious target of $5 trillion in the next 5 years. You speak to, you're constantly in touch with businesses. How do we offset those two challenges? Or is that even a debate to begin with?
Yeah, thank you. I think to my mind, there's actually no room for further debate. With the data that was presented and with all the data that already exists, there's enough evidence that, even though India is one of the least emitters of GHG emissions and has been on a high growth trajectory, it's an economic growth champion for the last decade, there's data that we've actually stunted our progress by almost 30% because of climate related impact.
Okay, would you like to elaborate on that?
And that particularly is true of the agriculture sector. I think I noticed that the report will talk about, maybe a further report will talk of the impact of this on agriculture. In fact, our own economic survey this year mentioned that there is already an ongoing projected loss of almost 62,000 crores on the agriculture sector because of the extreme weather events that we are seeing, which is severe droughts, much more, extreme rainfall, and therefore erratic weather patterns, the crop yields going down, and there's a huge damage to the crop yields resulting in this loss to the agriculture sector.
Right.
Now, if you just look at that one sector, which employs nearly 50% of the total workforce, right, there's huge impact. Couple this with what was projected again in the report, which talked about higher number of heat days. Already we are in India witnessing throughout the summer maybe temperatures up to 45 degrees centigrade, right?
Sure.
Which really will have an impact on the productivity.
Sure.
Which means you have to manage your human resources better.
Yes.
Then if you couple with this the disasters, like you had the erratic southern monsoon, the floods in Kerala, the cyclone Fani, the cost of rebuilding, the cost of rescuing runs into billions of dollars.
Kamal Kishore, we've heard the good news, to put it mildly. But just to start off with you, because with the NDMA, first of all, is there an acknowledgement within the establishment that there has been an increase in these extreme climatic events and that this is linked to climate change?
Oh, absolutely. I think the writing is on the wall. We can see across the country changing geography of floods, more incidents of heat waves, more number of heat wave days. Just as we speak, I don't know in my living memory I've ever seen 3 cyclones brewing at the same time in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea combined. So that's something doesn't feel right.
Are there examples that you've been conversant with across India, different states or different models, where there are some positive stories or some solutions?
I mean, I gave you the all India statistics on heat wave, and if you look at some specific places, Nagpur, you look at Ahmedabad,
sure,
you look at some places in some other cities in Maharashtra as well. Basically, the response to this is threefold to emerging heat wave threat, for example, because the topic of this thing is heat induced. Number one is that you have to really localize the climate and risk information. It is no longer enough to just do red, orange, green traffic lights for the whole country. Localization is one. The second is that this is something which requires a response which cuts across sectors. It's not the responsibility of Disaster Management Authority alone. it is the labor department, so that you close work on sites. They are the most vulnerable.
Right.
It's like I live in Delhi. The Delhi has heat wave. It doesn't affect me at all because I'm not vulnerable. So you have to have targeted,
Okay.
and it has to be a cross-sectoral response.
Okay, that's number two.
Number two, and number three is really coming up with solutions which are not just quick fixes. We have to. Our built environment is the biggest source of vulnerability.
Right.
Even government has been building buildings which are not conducive to heat conditions.
Okay.
So long-term shift in how we build, how we shape our built environment. So
These
once
are
we
all
do
important.
these three things, these are trends, but trend is not destiny. It can all be arrested and even reversed.
Michael, to the point that you began with, saying that India was at this odd juncture where it's also still a growing economy, but it's also one of the largest producers of carbon emissions. Are there examples from around the world of countries in a similar situation to India, but which are doing a better job of balancing out both, that we could draw from?
I think China has been a really good example of dealing with the air pollution problem while continuing to grow. And I think there's something to be learned from what they're doing, and that has also produced climate co-benefits along the way. So that's a really good example.
Right, but that's specific to air pollution though.
Yes.
But overall, I mean, if you look at the main sort of source of the production of emissions, which is to do with essentially industrial growth,
Yeah.
China still
No,
has a
China's
long way to go.
still
So
chugging along. Yeah, it's very hard. It's going to require, that's why I think it requires forceful policy, both nationally and then linked internationally. It's hard to do it without it.
Kamal Kishore, to your point that this is not the responsibility of any one entity alone, like the NDMA, and that everyone has to work in concert. So in a way, you're dealing with the effect of climate change. The causes of it, as we mentioned, are coming from the way a country devises or designs how it grows. How much coordination is there amongst these different arms of the government? Because you need to have all the different sectors, verticals, working together. Those who design industrial policy, those who design policy connected to power generation, coal production, so on and so forth, along with what you do. How much of that actually happens?
So not enough. But I will divide that in two parts. On short-term actions, like for example, right now there's a cyclone brewing in the Arabian Sea. It's going to affect Lakshadweep and some parts of the western coast. When there is a short-term and the emergency is facing right in our face, emergency is right in our face, I think we do a very good job of working across sectors. So on the short term, I think we do a good job, and that has shown results. There is dramatic reduction in mortality from cyclones. 94% reduction in mortality over the last 15 years or so. But when it comes to long term and really sort of working across sectors, I think we have to do much better. Basically, we need to do four things. We need to do a much better job of assessing risk, which goes beyond the specific assets.
Right.
So if you're building a dedicated freight corridor, you just don't look at just the risk to it, but the downstream risk it may create. The second is much better job of creating new standards and regulations, which are responsive to not just the current climate, but also the future climate. And that's beginning to happen now. And you have to realize that there are some infrastructure sectors which are new. And the third is really much better job of finance to encourage resilience and a better system to recover from disasters so that you build back better.
Naseema, is any of this actually happening, both vis-a-vis the policy makers as well as industry? Because again, I hate to keep sort of coming back to specifics, but the devil really is in the detail. And if 70% of our electricity generation is still going to be coal-based, we continue to import coal because the quality of our coal is poor. And we need that electricity generation as well to run industry, to grow, for jobs, etc., etc. What do we do?
So to the point that first Kamal made, and I think very important point, that as we build, and we have to build more and more infrastructure, how do we make it's low carbon, it's resilient, and that's where I think a specific example is what the green building movement in the country has done, right? Again, pioneered completely by the private sector, voluntarily it started. India has the largest green building footprint outside the United States. What it has done is made sure that the buildings that we have built are completely low carbon. Similarly, what the minister was saying about agriculture, you change the agriculture practices so that you demand side management, so you don't grow the wrong kind of crop, and when you grow the crop, you use the minimum amount of water. So those are and then when you don't need to irrigate, you don't need to run your pump, you don't need the coal, which is required to feed the electricity to run the pump. So,
sure.
So you actually look at the entire value chain and say, how do you make it more efficient and resilient?
Fair enough. It's not as if India isn't trying. But the data that I was looking at, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is really not my specific area of domain expertise, is that our emission reduction rate has remained flat for a decade. It's about 12% a year, and it's pretty much remained that throughout. So
I think, look, the number one way you can do that is by pricing emissions. You could put a tax on emissions, and for sure that would change the trajectory.
Would CII be okay with a tax on emissions?
Well, there's already a coal tax, and I think there is, there is a need to look at different types of mitigation instruments, as we say,
right,
including pricing of carbon, because
right,
all of these options exist today, and we must look at these options.
Michael, as we start to wrap up our conversation and start going into questions, obviously in something as complex as climate change, there's no one bad guy. So it's not India acting in isolation. There are other economies, countries, which in a sense are greater emitters. America and China top the list. How much is all of this interlinked, and how do we handle that dynamic?
Yeah, so I think the only real way to address this is through international negotiations, where every country does a little bit more, because if the US does something, it's going to benefit India, and then India will do a little bit more, and that will benefit the US. And I think we have to, with President Trump, the international negotiations have probably slowed down quite a bit, and I think those would have to be reinvigorated, and I think that's the best path forward.
And Seema, do you again feel that perhaps it's important to also reframe how we define growth? Because rather than just make it about this relentless pursuit of saying 7, 8, 9, 10%, factor in that this is also a reality.
Completely. I think growth is to be factored, so it's basically not just the GDP that has to be measured. You have to look at whether it's sustainable and it's inclusive. The point that he's making, there are several sets, of course, layers here, but two big layers. There is the mitigation part of it, which we must at the global level also fight and say that, okay, how do we all take targets which are very important, and should they be common and differentiated, etc., all that. But there's that entire social issue here. There's an issue of livelihoods here. So that has to be dealt with domestically. Right. And for that purpose, we need to make the growth social, sustainable, inclusive. For that purpose, for our own people, we need to do it. I mean, it's okay to talk of the world, but for our own people, first we need to do it as well.
Okay. Wonderful. So let's open this up now for questions.
We keep the focus of the cities of resilience, and by design, we ensure that people comply to the lower emissions. We bring the compliance in terms by how we design the city. So what kind of reduction in emission do you think we'll be able to achieve?
Building standards and things like that are important for reducing emissions, but I often think when you're trying to go for a goal, you should shoot right at it, and shooting at building standards kind of requires a bank shot. It might work, it might not, and I think the policies that tackle emissions directly are much more likely to be effective.
As the coal energy demand is increasing through the time, and we are increasing even though renewable energies are coming into the play, so how can you say when the emissions are reducing, is it compared to the right at the moment the emissions are there, is it compared to that level or the predicted levels in the future?
So maybe I'll clarify. Basically, the emissions intensity is going down. The absolute emissions is increasing. And that is what's happening, right? So emissions intensity over a period of time, from 2009, as I think was the baseline, it has come down for India. And that's despite the GDP growing. So there is a decoupling of some sort happening, but not necessarily that the coal is not being used, right? Renewable is increasing, as we know. It's becoming competitive, but there's this whole question, as everybody knows, about the base load that you have to provide. So unless the storage solutions, you need those innovative storage solutions so that you can actually say that you can move a base load situation also onto renewable, which we still don't have that. And that's where, I think some innovation is needed.
Sorry, I know there are more questions, but we're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed for being part of this. It's been a great panel, and to the audience as well. If we can have a round of applause for our panel, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed.